Good afternoon and welcome to our event on a new approach to carbon dioxide removal. So leading climate models have made clear that deployment of carbon dioxide removal is unavoidable if we want to achieve net zero emissions. The recent sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made clear that all pathways that aim to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited or no overshoot will require on the order of 100 to 1,000 billion tons of CO2 to be removed from the atmosphere during the 21st century. While reductions must, of course, remain the key priority for climate action at all times, removals can play a really key role in climate action in three different ways. Firstly, they can achieve further reductions of emissions in the near term, and then work to counterbalance emissions, residual emissions, in order to reach net zero, and in the long term, try to achieve negative emissions and sustain negative emissions on this planet. Recent developments at the policy level have been occurred at the European and the United States. This week, the European Union has announced a new target for the land use and forestry sector, where the European Union will now aim to achieve 300 million tons of removals by 2030. The European Union is also working to establish a carbon removal certification framework, which a proposal of which is due from the European Commission in just about a week. And this framework will sort of aim to create a certification mechanism, the first of its kind at a governmental level, to certify carbon removals which have been removed from the atmosphere. In the United States, we've also seen the Inflation Reduction Act, where a key funding mechanism is provided for direct air capture, where $185 a ton has been provided for CO2, which is captured from the atmosphere and permanently stored in geological sequestrations. The United States has also provided funding for regional direct air capture hubs last year in the Infrastructure and Investments and Jobs Act. But despite these key policy developments, the carbon removals market has a number of key problems and issues, namely the lack of high quality removals. Many actors in the space continue to profit from carbon offsets, which remove to no atmosphere or CO2 from the atmosphere. And so today we aim with a very exciting panel. We've got speakers lined up from civil society, from politics, from industry, technology providers, as well as a lead author from the IPCC to establish how can we provide a new approach to carbon removal, one which involves clear targets, establish effective regulation, and proper policy and financing mechanisms to achieve greater carbon removals. Firstly, we have Mark Preston Aragonès. Mark's a carbon accounting policy manager at Bellona Europa, which is an international environmental NGO founded on advancing important climate solutions, important technologies and solutions to reduce climate change. Mark's been working on removals for almost 5 years in European Union, heading their work at the policy level. We also have Dr. Oliver Geden, who's a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, where he advises the German Parliament as well as the federal government. And his work focuses mainly on European and global climate policy, and in particular on carbon removals. Oliver has also coordinated the assessment of carbon removals in the Working Group 3 on mitigation as part of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC. And he's also a member of the core writing group of the IPCC's AR6 synthesis report, which is due in March of next year. We also have Dr. Helen Bray, who is European Policy Director of Carbon Engineering, which is a technology provider of direct air capture. Helen joined Carbon Engineering in 2021 after about 20 years in the energy sector and leads their European policy work in order to accelerate direct air capture. Helen is also joined by members of 1.5 who've established a partnership with Carbon Engineering for their first large-scale plant in Texas in the United States. We also have Alexander Wielgos, who's the accredited parliamentary assistant in the European Parliament, where he is assistant to Anna Zalewska, who's MEP, as part of the European Conservative and Reformist Group. Alex is working on several files as part of the Environmental Committee, including carbon removals, and also works with the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment in order to advance carbon removals in Poland. So, my first question is to Oliver. In the recent report from the IPCC, tried to adopt a new framing away from nature versus technical removals. How can policymakers try to better use this new framing that the IPCC has adopted?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, we are familiar with that distinction, nature-based or ecosystem-based versus technological or engineering. The IPCC did not take that framing because the IPCC finds that quite unhelpful, at least from a scientific point of view. And the main framing in terms of clustering is timescales of storage. It's simple as that, because the main benefit, the intended main benefit of carbon removal is to store carbon away as long as we can, and therefore the timescale of storage is relevant. Of course, you can look at characteristic timescales of storage for certain methods or certain clusters of methods, and if it's biological storage in soils and vegetation, it's characteristically shorter than, for example, in geological storage. But if you think about something like biochar, that already defies that clear delineation. So the preference from an IPCC perspective is look at timescale of storage and look at the properties of individual methods.
Thanks, Oliver. My next question is for Mark. So, Mark, there are several key problems with the current market for carbon removals. What do you think are the main ones that we should try to address?
Well, I guess the first problem is there isn't really a market for carbon removals. Most of the discussion has been focused on offsetting, which is a controversial way to address your emissions from the NGO perspective. Generally, the offsets that have been traded are either avoided emissions or emission reductions, which don't really get us where we need to be when it comes to net zero, which is obviously a balance between an emission and a removal. The more difficult part of the question when it comes to removals is that in the type of removals that one can purchase at the moment, generally the choice that we see is either a very cheap removal in the land sector, for example, in soils, removals in soils, versus on the other hand, the more expensive but also likely much more reliable removals in geological storage, which can go for up to $1,000 a ton. So the problem really is that there is many different ways of removing CO2 from the atmosphere with very different types of permanence, as Oliver alluded to, but they're used, and once someone has bought that offset, it's used in the same way regardless of what that permanence is.
Thanks, Mark. So my next question is for Alex. So you obviously work as a policymaker, or you assist policymaking in the European Parliament. What do you think are the main outstanding questions which policymakers really need answering at this stage?
That's an excellent question. So I want to say that within the EU law-making context, each of the institutions have an array of overlapping interests that unfortunately or fortunately we have to take into consideration and make sure that we align carbon removal with them. So within the Council, it's a balance of 27 EU member states. Within the Parliament, it's a balance of several different groups, and each delegation has their own priorities and interests, and they do really play out in the decision-making process. And I want to give a useful example, actually, with the land use change and forestry regulation revision that we concluded the last negotiation just 1 week ago. And an example here, which I think is pertinent, is that was Article 13b, which is the introduction of a flexibility mechanism specifically for natural disasters. So in a situation where in the LULUCF regulation, for context, we have a legally binding goal of 310 megatons CO2 equivalent by 2030 that we as EU 27 have to absorb as net emissions and removals, which is also composed of 27 sub-targets on the national level. The allocation of which some countries are happy with them, other countries not so much. And in this flexibility mechanism, for example, if a member state experiences the tragedy of a forest fire, a bark beetle infestation, strong winds, the wind, should they be held accountable for this? Well, the member state would say that, well, this was beyond our control, therefore we cannot. On the other side, we also do not want to make sure that the member state has a getaway card for free. They're like, I don't really feel like doing a carbon sink policy this time, so I'm just going to use that flexibility in Article 13b. No, that's not the case. So the first takeaway I would say is to, and this is also goes into the moral hazard discussion, of course. So to take into consideration all of the specific things, but it's that extra reassurance for policymakers that one thing is not inhibited over the other. The second takeaway, and my boss is a pragmatic, she always talks about, is about financing. Knowing that there is a very real source to bring this policy into life, rather than just punitive measures. So with this one, I think a good example is that we talk about the innovation funds. There was a DAX summit at the end of June this year, where DG Klima talked about a potential source of income for this being the innovation fund from the EU ETS. However, we know that in practice, the geographical distribution of this fund isn't perfect, so some countries will feel like they miss out, and it's overly subscribed. So we need definitely different creative sources to bring funding for this.
Thanks, Alex. And so my next question is for Helen. So as a technology provider, as an actor here in the private sector, what do you think are the most important challenges that we currently face in order to accelerate rapid, responsible deployment of direct air capture?
Thank you for the question. And if I may, today is Solutions Day, and we started with a really high energy CDR launch. And I'd just like to point out that as a tech provider, we're completely reliant on others to scale our technology. 1.5 are in the audience. Amro and Rob, thank you. And then also, I had the pleasure of a morning with the resource geologist for King Ranch, Catherine. And this is a fantastic site. This has up to 3 billion tons of permanent geological storage. And you can imagine 30 1 million ton direct air capture plants permanently storing carbon in the future. And it just blew me away when this was first announced, and I'm super excited by where this market is going and what we're doing. But what do we need? Well, you've mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's a big boost, and that's where you're seeing all the activity that 1.5 is doing in America. But generally it goes down to two things. R&R. You need regulation. You need to have proper monitoring, reporting, and verification. We need to prove to you, the customer, that what we're doing is a net remover. And this needs to be given oversight from regulators or by third parties who work in conjunction with regulators. And then we need to be able to have and make revenue. We need a financeable revenue stream. That is the way that you're going to be able to scale this durable carbon removal. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So Oliver, we've heard now from policymakers that the difficulties in creating policies to accelerate carbon removals, particularly in the European Union, where you've 27 different member states, each with their own different priorities. We've also heard from the private sector and sort of like different funding streams are going to be needed. Who should be responsible for accelerating carbon removal? What sort of mechanisms really what is the role for government or governments in this respect?
Well, I think at this point we see a huge role for the voluntary carbon markets to get at least some initial investments going, but probably in the medium to long term we need compliance markets to provide for that certainty that huge amounts of carbon dioxide removals are really being demanded. I think the net zero targets have put some discipline into the discussion, because you have to look at any source of CO2 or GHGs and say, okay, what can we actually do with that? That has increased attention for so-called hard-to-transition sectors, even such where we won't use carbon dioxide removal necessarily, like the cement sector, but which gets then accompanying infrastructure discussions about CO2 transport and CO2 storage accelerated as well. I think specifically for the European Union, I could say that many governments are not there yet knowing what is their exact position on carbon dioxide removal. What do they know? What do they need exactly? I mean, LULUCF has been around for quite some while. We have accounting rules that probably can be improved substantially. What has been new in the European Union when we announced our new 55% target, for the first time, we included LULUCF removals in that target. We also capped the use of these removals towards achieving 55%. We were always, for the last, I think, 20 years, a net remover in LULUCF, but we did not account for it in terms of accounting it towards target achievement. Of course, it was on the national inventories. You might have heard Commissioner Timmermans saying, okay, the EU is now upgrading the EU NDC from 55 to 57%. That's exactly due to the new LULUCF regulation. So it's made possible by removals, which I find an interesting policy development, because it entirely goes against the moral hazard story. So you make possible a higher target through additional removals. Whatever you think about the accounting in LULUCF, whatever you think about the realism behind making the net sink stronger in the European Union, because it has been declining over years. So I think what we will see now in the coming year, with the carbon removal certification mechanism being published as a draft by the European Commission, then member states and European Parliament will start really getting serious about carbon dioxide removal. First about certification, at some point about incentive. And what's interesting, that in the European Union you usually have target decisions far ahead. So I would expect that already in 2024 we'll get a discussion about the EU 2040 target, and then about a removal component in that, in terms of volumes, but also in terms of what should fill that void methods-wise, and probably also discussion about a sub-target. So at least in the European Union, I would say that's the way to go. There are some member states with a very specific industry structure. For example, Sweden comes to mind. They have a lot of biogenic CO2 in pulp and paper industries, and therefore they already know they're going to need bags, and therefore they're already at that point saying, okay, let's have a reverse auctioning mechanism, even if you can't account for the removals under EU and UNFCCC inventory rules maybe, but we're going to need it anyway. So that's one example where a country finds out, okay, this is our way in this, and then we'll try to lobby for rules that are in conformity with national interest on the EU and on the global level.
Interesting points there on the new target and sort of how it seems like increased reliance on removals in order to show for increased ambition. Mark, what do you think about this sort of new reliance on land removals? Is this something that we really need to be? Is this really a good thing that we should be focusing on? Is to show that we're increasing our ambition, but really the amount of emissions reductions are remaining the same?
Well, I think there's a fundamental lack of transparency in that, and you mentioned the European climate law, where we have a net 55% target, where there's a capped contribution from the land sink, which was at 225 million tons from the LULUCF. And this is something that originally, when the European Commission proposed the European climate law, they just proposed net 55 without any sort of distinction. And that would have played right into the moral hazard risk that you're alluding to. And we had to fight very hard with other NGOs to make sure that there was a distinction. We wanted there to be 55% reduction target, and on top of that, a target to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. In the end, what we got is a compromise where they still kept a net 55% target, and the capped contribution means that the EU now has a fixed emission reduction target of 52.8% by 2030. That means that when the EU increased its LULUCF targets to 310 million tons, the EU now has a de facto 57% net reduction target. On the one hand, it's good that we're increasing the land sink. It's hard to argue against that. It's very much trying to reverse the trend where the land sink is currently declining. It's going to be a lot of work to make it go back up to 310 million tons. But on the other hand, it's a little bit misleading to say that the EU is going to be reducing its emissions by 57%, even though technically it's net reductions by 57%. When people see 57%, they just think the EU is reducing its emissions by 57%, when really they're just reducing it by 52.8%, and they're capitalizing on the land sink as a way to make themselves look a little bit better. Reducing CO2 is not the same as removing it in the land sink, and I think that's the fundamental problem in this net target.
So, Mark, you've discussed the difficulties in sort of the reductions and removals. Need to keep it separate. But Helen, do you think there's sort of synergies that we can generate here between reductions and removals in terms of infrastructure, perhaps? Like, are there needs which policymakers can address for both without risking, not being ambitious enough in our reductions, but also creating a market for removals in the future? Are there ways in which policymakers can address both in the same way?
No, you're right. The policy framework needs to accelerate greenhouse gas emissions reductions and also enable all forms of carbon removal to grow. And what's really important for us, we do direct air capture, we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with our plant developers, is we need to have that open access storage, geological transportation and storage in Europe. That's how it works in Europe. You tend to have a lot of people in the supply chain and different players doing the transportation and storage of CO2. So European policy ultimately needs to enable reductions via carbon capture and storage to enable a future removals market using direct air capture into storage. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alex, as a follow-up question to that, we've heard a lot about what's going on at the European policy, the new targets are being set for removals. How do you think the certification mechanism should be generated? What sort of questions do you need to think answering from the Commission when you are faced with this proposal that's hoped to be produced by the end of this month?
So the carbon removal certification mechanism, we expect to be published on the 30th of November. And from my perspective as an assistant that's going to be doing the nitty-gritty, we know for sure that there will be a definitions article for that in that CRCM, including a definition for carbon removal. We know that the Working Group 3 reports, chapter C11.1, I remember the very first sentence does come up with a definition for carbon removal. I already know that the very first draft is not exactly identical. And so I know that I will be tabling amendments to this article for this definition, maybe. And then across the entirety of the spectrum, people will also be tabling amendments to this definition. And then the end result might be either unchanged or it might become a slight deformity, as I know has happened. So what is needed from, I would say, the carbon removal circle, if I may call it this, is constant pressure and technical guidance. That leads into my first intervention about the interests, overlapping interests. So generally there are two, I think, and the one is the moral hazard. So there are some groups in the European Parliament that are just adamantly against carbon removal. Like, they have an allergic reaction to it. There are some which are unconvinced, skeptical, and if they are not sure, they will automatically react as to no. And then there are some which are ardent supporters of it, as insofar as they know that it exists. So the ones that are against, what they need is to know that, and this is relevant to talking about a net target, if it's better if we're looking at the final results, is that the reduction policy is not affected with an increased removal policy, or, and this is where I'm guessing some of the discussion might go into, will be that if we increase a removal policy, then a reduction policy shouldn't be decreased by more than what the removal policy brings, so that the net outcome is still positive for climate. Will this be acceptable to some groups? Surely not. Will it be acceptable to others? And it comes down to, we talk about that carbon removal needs a patchwork of different creative solutions because every member state is so different. So the more technical work we can do on each member state, because 1 kilometer square at the south of Italy is very different than that to the north of Sweden, for instance. So including whether it's technological carbon removals or those that fall under the LULUCF sector, the more nitty-gritty we can give the assurances that each country is treated fairly, then the better chance we have of propelling the carbon removal policy. So in the CRCM, questions would be about specific definitions and about how it's adjusted for the specific local conditions of each member state. Mm-hmm. Those would be like the two things that I would add to my first intervention.
So, Mark, we've heard now from Oliver. He's kind of outlined, we need to move away from this sort of technological versus nature distinct dichotomy. We've also heard from Alex that that there's going to be issues because we have a lot of problems that with sort of how these credits or how this certification mechanism is going to be designed. It's very difficult to identify, because all different all removals methods are sort of different. They have different time scales of storage, perhaps. Is there a way we can actually make sense of this? Is there a concept that we can understand in terms of how the different carbon cycles move and the way in which the certification mechanism should be designed in order to fit that?
Well, I think you've outlined it quite well. There are different ways of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. They have different levels of permanence. The way that permanence is met is mostly separated into either physical permanence, where we can quite observably tell that CO2 is not going to go back into the atmosphere, or where that CO2 needs to be managed basically perpetually to prevent it from going back into the atmosphere. Those two different approaches don't really work well together. So I think that there needs to be, within this carbon removal certification framework, there has to be separate buckets, where on the one hand there is storage that is longer term or geological, or whichever phrasing we prefer to use. In this context, I would probably go for geological. And then on the other hand, the biological, where it's much more cyclical. And then the question becomes much more about liabilities and how to make sure that whenever there is a reversal, that reversal is addressed to preserve the integrity of that original ton that was removed. That does leave the question of where does biochar fit in, where there has been discussion about having a third category where carbon storage in products, but that's a very, very complicated, that's a whole patchwork of different types of removal timescales. Basically, we need to have different buckets for different types of removals that can be used in different ways, where the ones that are more observably permanent might be able to be used for some kind of balancing out in the long term. And in the second bucket, where the storage is in a more temporary sort of land sink that needs more management, those don't really lend themselves well for those types of balancing. If we're trying to balance a fossil emission with a biological removal, that doesn't really turn out very well in terms of net zero. And then for the storage in products, the monitoring, reporting, and verification for those types of products that move around everywhere, that's going to be extremely complicated. I don't really think that there's a viable way to produce carbon removal credits from such types of removals. So we need to be thinking about different types of incentives for different types of removals and not try to lump them all into one beast.
So Helen, we've heard now from Mark and sort of his thinking and the way in which the certification mechanism should be designed for the different types of removals and sort of the length of storage. For a direct air capture provider, what are you hoping to get out of the certification mechanism in terms of financing your projects that you're trying to accelerate inside the European Union? Is there different ways in which these credits could be, there certificates that certify a ton of removal permanently stored? Is there a way in which those can help accelerate your business and sort of how do you think the industry what do you think the industry is going to look for from the certification mechanism?
Well, I think the certification mechanism is mainly around your social license to operate. It's proving to your customer that what you're providing is a net removal. And that's really important to us. And that's why we always call for strong regulation on this. Now, how that certificate will be used and where it fits, I mean, I don't know how it will evolve. The proposal is not out until the end of November. But you could imagine that maybe that would be able to be used to sell offtake from the plants that we're building. We have plants in the UK, in the Norway that are going through engineering, and then obviously we've talked a bit about America. So I'm hoping there that it will give us that license to operate. We can tell people what we're doing with certainty. But there still needs to be an investable policy framework. Here we're talking about Europe. We don't quite have that yet. Certification and voluntary carbon market alone doesn't quite add up. So we need a really good open conversation on where is the role for technical, permanent carbon removal? Where does it sit in Europe's climate policy framework? And how can we create that investable policy framework so that we can finance these plants? Thank you.
Thank you. And just on the financing aspect, are there tools available that you're sort of looking at in terms of which way, specific policy instruments that either governments or private actors can take in order to accelerate removals? Are we talking about perhaps procurement from governments? Is everything to be left to the voluntary carbon market and high quality removals, or is there a role for governments to take real action here in ensuring that these high quality removals can scale in the early stages in particular?
Definitely. I mean, all options, and we heard this morning that it's a range of policy measures. If you're going to give me government procurement, that's fantastic. If you're going to consider how to integrate into compliance carbon markets while still preserving that need to accelerate emissions reductions, if you're thinking of other measures such as tax credits, it all needs to fit together. And the IEA's latest report on direct air capture has a great table there that lists all the different policy measures that stack up to create this investable policy framework. So it's not one or the other, it's a number of policy measures to create that incentive to invest. Thank you.
So Oliver, you've mentioned a sort of emphasis on storage is how we should look at removals. But obviously some forms of removals are going to be able to scale quicker and faster than, or quicker and cheaper than others, particularly in the land sector, while others, maybe direct air capture and geological storage, might take longer to scale. Is there a sort of way in which we can make sense in terms of like something like a shifting portfolio approach? Is that something that you think would be a welcome way of looking at sort of removals in general? Or how can sort of the general public even try to make sense of the IPCC's evidence and thinking on removals in general?
Well, I think that in Europe, but not only in Europe, policymakers, governments, parliaments have to start defining durability thresholds. Maybe not in the sense of permanence versus non-permanence, but at least cluster methods via characteristic timescales of storage. And governments haven't done that so far, and that's a problem. They treat removals from the LULUCF sector equal to how they would treat a removal from direct air capture combined with carbon storage. So that needs to be done. That will be done in different ways in different countries. That will be interesting to see how these regulatory frameworks then compare. It will also influence how then in the medium term rules will be created for that. Because let's say it's hard to put a number of years on it, but in the end you will have UNFCCC national inventory rules for that, and you will have guidance by the IPCC task force on inventories on that. For many approaches we already have that. We already have that, of course, for the LULUCF methods, but also for biochar. So I think the European Union or the European Commission, which is the main policy entrepreneur right now, already claims that they want to set a high quality standard. It's interesting that the leaked proposals is full of the word quality. Let's say it's that the self-image of the European Union in climate policy that they can do that. It's a little bit questionable if the proposal as we know it so far, will live up to that standard. Whether we will get to these distinctions in the early phase, it's unclear. Again, we don't know what governments and the parliament really want. There's one element that is a little bit confusing for many outsiders. The Commission is now betting on something it is calling carbon farming, including forestry here, but it's more about extending incentive schemes and the CDR debate into agriculture, which is basically politics. And I think that's the main point we will see in every country. The task is to integrate carbon dioxide removal into existing climate policy. And since existing climate policy is done so differently in different countries, there will be different ways. So for the European Union, you have 3 pillars of climate policy, and maybe the ETS, the emissions trading system, the non-traded sectors, and LULUCF. And you could simply say, okay, certain removals can only be used in certain pillars. That US will have a different approach, Canada will have a different approach. That's unclear. Also, there will be a learning phase, seeing how they do it elsewhere. I would say we are not there yet. We don't know what the instruments will be. And I think we will use a portfolio of instruments we already know from emissions reductions policies. So carbon contracts for difference will play a role, public procurement will play a role, direct regulation will play a role, carbon pricing will play a role, but what we can't say yet what it will be. Of course, the really interesting and very specific carbon dioxide removal element will be once countries try to turn net negative. So the European Union already has that in the climate law, net negative GHG after 2050. Germany has that in its climate law, Finland. And then really interesting question will become how to secure the money to finance that exactly.
So we're getting close to our time for a Q&A, so if you've got any questions, make sure we're going to have a lot of time to discuss. But Oliver, I think the discussion so far has been quite focused on very much on what's going on in Europe, and obviously that's related because a lot of us are based and work out of Europe. What do you think there are lessons here that maybe members from the Global South can learn in terms of like how the discussion on removals is being framed in Europe? Are there ways in which we can also accelerate removals development outside of the industrialized countries, and is there a mechanism, there's been a lot of developments in Article 6, for example, this week. Is this the way in which we need to develop removals in the developing world, or are there lessons they can take and do it themselves?
I mean, there are different approaches on that. I don't buy into the buzz around Article 6, and I would say to gain public trust in carbon dioxide removal policy, it's at this point much about responsibilities, and it's quite clear which countries would have to be the front runners here. So in a way, if the Article 6.4 discussion is stalled, I don't mind that much. And I think that the European Union, the UK, and North America should go forward at this point.
So, Alex, now we've had a lot of discussions from people who are in the foray here, and the goal of this event really was to try and establish a new approach to carbon dioxide removal. But are we really trying? Are we, is there a way in which we can actually move a path forward as policymakers? Is this sort of making sense and clear to you as an assistant to a policymaker at the European level?
That is incredible. I've actually thought about this one at length. So with me and my boss, we talk about this quite a lot, and there is one which I believe it will probably not be applicable in every circumstance, of course. However, that is something that gives a positive spin that might be applicable in certain situations. So, of course, the climate catastrophe and first incentive to solve it as a problem is that we as a human species, we might survive and leave a livable planet. That is the first incentive, of course. However, trying to put twist it around a little bit, it's a food for thought, and I do want to bring the other panelists' opinion onto this, is that can we treat the excess CO2 in the ambient atmosphere as a resource to utilize that will be hopefully diminishing over time until we reach a certain threshold. So if we treat the CO2 in the air as a resource that we should, and you can do it from anywhere in the world because it's up in the atmosphere, as something that we should be getting and depleting at some point. And so what can we use it for? Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind, if we set it up properly, would be a carbon removal credit. And the second thing, I don't know, maybe from carbon engineering we can get some insight if we can utilize in products. Of course, they will be counted as a removal only insofar as this CO2 exists in that product until it's re-emitted again. So it would be a temporary removal rather than a permanent one, which we classify as 1,000 years geological sequestration. So this would be a first kind of approach that may be applicable in some times. The second one, I would say, is that if we do exceed 1.5, carbon removal probably is our key to reverse that, because we are removing CO2 that has been already emitted into the atmosphere. So if, unfortunately, we do exceed that 1.5, it doesn't mean that it's a lost cause and we give up, but it means that we do have some beacon of hope to reverse that and get back to 1.5 in the future for those hard-to-abate emissions. And I mean hard-to-abate emissions technically and hard-to-abate emissions politically as well. So those would be two ideas. The third one maybe is that divide a gigantic undertaking into little itty steps. It celebrates, because every 0.1 degree counts, right? So all the individual small undertakings, they have value and we should be acknowledging them.
Do we have any questions from the audience at this point about anything that's been discussed so far? Oh.
Hi, thanks very much, Tim Dixon, IAGHG. Just a question on the compliance market side and DAX. Oliver, we want to encourage the IPCC Task Force Inventories to include DAX in their inventories. What's the best way of getting countries to nominate this onto their work programme? And then just a comment to Alexander's point about going net negative if we exceed 1.5. Of course, we know that's a lot harder because when you're trying to go net negative, you get the Earth systems degassing CO2 that they've absorbed from the land and the oceans. So you've got to do much more work then in the removals. So I hope we don't have to get to that point as well. But the question is really on how can we help get IPCC TFI to include DAX? Thank you.
Well, on the IPCC question, it's an intergovernmental panel on climate change, so you would simply do that via delegations to the IPCC and probably talk to more than one, and at some point they decide about the work program, and once they see that certainly technologies and projects are getting deployed on the ground, you will also find an understanding that that needs somehow to be regulated or accounted for. Specifically, it was not a question, but I think the outgassing issue I would not see so dramatic because it's basically, I mean, the efficiencies can be different if you put CO2 into the atmosphere or try to take it out, but already right now a ton of CO2 emitted does not completely stay in the atmosphere but goes into the ocean and to the land. So if you go net negative, of course, these processes somehow reverse, but I don't think it's overly dramatic in terms of removal efficiency.
Hi, my name is Kamma. I come from Green by Iceland, and we have a company called CarbFix, which does carbon capture and mineralization, which is a very new technology. So I'm wondering I would love to hear your thoughts on how the European legal framework can adapt to this sort of completely new idea that no one would have even thought of 20 years ago.
So as far as I understand, so there's the CO2 storage directive, which regulates the storage of CO2 in geological formations, which currently does not include mineralization. If the process that you describe were to meet the requirements of that, and we could, if we could include it into the guidance of those documents, then it could become something that would be included as a way to permanently store CO2. As far as I understand, we're not there yet. So it's not on the table, but I wouldn't put it off the table yet. I wouldn't sort of not start to put it there.
Maybe I could just add that the upcoming CRCM would probably be a good place to look at. So that is the most immediate point of reference, that first thing that comes to mind.
And I forgot to mention, in the context of the emission trading system, at the moment you don't need to surrender an allowance if you meet the requirements of the CO2 storage directive, or under the new agreement that will be done soon, in cases where CO2 is utilized in a manner intended to be permanent, where the CO2 is stored in a manner intended to be permanent. The Commission is working on a so-called delegated act, which is a European legalese for they're doing an assessment into how to do it. They'll be looking into what types of approaches count in meeting those requirements. So CO2 stored in a product in a manner that keeps it away from the atmosphere permanently.
Hi, Wim Carton, Lund University. I have two questions, if I may. So you talked about the importance of distinguishing and having two buckets, as you say, right? The geological and the biological. And of course, the reason that matters is because we don't want biological land-based removals to be offsetting fossil fuel emissions. Now, everything that we see in carbon markets, including discussion on Article 6 and even in NDCs, is that, there's no such distinction being made. So I'm wondering if you know of any initiatives underway to kind of, bring that into practice. I know you mentioned the other day the German climate law where you put a proposal forward. But so I'm curious to hear if there's anything else on the international or European level in terms of making that distinction. And then the second question is, we had this launch pad this morning, as you also mentioned, where a number of countries, talked about pilot demonstration plants, funding for demonstration plants for CDR. Now, the interesting thing there is that some of the things that were mentioned were not CDR at all, right? It was CCS was mentioned, for example, by Canada, Denmark as well. And there's a tendency to put CCS into these emerging CDR policies. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on like the pros and cons of this, I guess, and the risks. I know some of the infrastructure, of course, is the same, and there's an argument for helping to scale CDR through also CCS, but there might be a risk with that as well, because obviously they do have different climate impacts. Thanks.
So if I can just answer the first question. I'm aware of some work at the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, where they're trying to make sure that emissions from flag sectors, so forestry, land and agriculture, can only be balanced out by biological removals. From a compliance perspective, there is no such, as far as I know, there isn't any policy that makes this distinction between geological and biological removals. Hence our proposal to get this done in Germany, in the German climate law. It is also something that we would like to see at the European level, perhaps in the context of the 2040 target, when that will be discussed, in the upcoming sort of change of legislature. We would find it very pertinent for there to be a 2040 target where there is an emission reduction target, an additional land sink target, and an additional geological removal target.
Sorry, I just have to comment on the German part. There is no such distinction in the German climate law. There is a LULUCF sub-target, but only because German lawmakers did not want to talk about any other kind of removal. And there is no connection being made what could be balanced out by these LULUCF removals. And the number is way too low if you compare it with potential numbers for residual emissions in 2045, the first year of net zero. Of course, you could, once you accompany that LULUCF net removal target by a non-LULUCF removal component, you could actually make that distinction, but then you would have to say for which kind of counterbalancing you could use it. But it's not there yet. It's just only LULUCF mentioned there. And if I may, on the CCS part, yeah, I would say on the one hand, it's important to talk about the common components that can be used for, let's say, conventional carbon management, but also for direct air capture with CCS or BECCS. But I think for the communication reasons, it would sometimes be easier if we just could, let's say, agree on a prefix for CCS when we're just talking about fossil fuel and process emissions, and then treat CCS or CCU just as the common component of something else. Then we would know what we're talking about. Quite often when people say CCS, they actually mean fossil fuel and process emission CCS, but maybe just put something in front of CCS and CCU, and then at least we would know what we are talking about. Talking about only about the component that is common to all, and then no prefix, or the prefix that indicates the origin of CO2. But to that launch pad and to other policymakers' discussions, yeah, many of them actually don't know. Removal is now the buzz, so you try to sell what you want to do anyway, which is not actually a removal, under removal. That happens in the land sector as well. Let's say ending peatland drainage is emissions avoidance. It's not removing CO2. So I think we have to overcome these confusions, but I'm quite confident once it becomes part of standard climate policy making, we will be there because policymakers also learn what kind of language to use.
And just to reiterate from industry, it's really important that removals are different from reductions, and a lot of the work we've been doing at this meeting is is to make it clear that Article 6.4, so this international cooperation, has to have a way to incorporate removals and all types of removals, and for us that's very different than a reduction. Thank you.
Excuse me, I have a question regarding the removal benefits, the ownership of the removal benefits, basically. Most of the business models that we have seen so far depends on major investors who can afford thousands or hundreds of thousands of removal credits. Do you think at some point we should actually talk about community ownership of removal benefits, as we have seen in the solar industry with community solars? That's a contentious point for frontline communities, or when we talk about carbon removal and climate justice. If you can speak a little bit about that.
I think insofar as we can talk about national climate targets, where we need to meet net zero targets at a national level, keeping that distinct from corporate targets. Is that any different than what you're talking about?
No. What I'm talking about is who owns the credit, because now the credits depend on purchase agreements in the thousand or hundreds of thousand credits. So regular people can't have access to that, even those who will benefit from, or these projects will be located in their own communities. For example, like one of the main advantages of direct air capture is that it can virtually be located anywhere once you have access to clean energy. But what about the communities that will have that? Because some of the resistance from the communities that we have seen is that this benefit is not coming to me. And some people think of direct air capture as a pollution control measurement rather than just like a CO2 control measurement. So for them, that distinction, as long as the benefits are concentrated with major corporates, it will be hard to get them on board with these types of projects.
I think it's really important. I think you're talking about co-benefits. So what does that investment in that community bring? And if we don't work with the local communities, we can't get anywhere. And I think that's really, really important. So I'm probably not an expert on who owns and all the commercial contracts, but without that very important discussions and license to operate, this social license to operate, we can't build with our plant developer this infrastructure, and that is ultimately the most important thing to get right. So it's definitely been discussed, and each project, depending on where it is, UK, Norway, America, Canada, will have its own local community that we need to work with. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I think we've had a really nice Q&A round. Just as sort of like finishing up with a lightning round, I guess each of the panelists maybe sum up what for you is the one key thing that you think needs to be addressed when it comes to carbon removals in general, in order to create a new approach to it? Is there one thing that in particular stands out to you as a key issue we need to overcome?
Well, from a European perspective, it would be dedicated targets, because that has been working in the European Union quite well. You have then a certain symbolic value, but also the bureaucracy then start working it out, what it exactly means. I know that's a luxury we have, but it sounds simple, and you get policymakers to that. Just create sub-targets in certain time steps.
We need an investable policy framework in Europe. Certification is our social license to operate, but we need to have that discussion now on what does that investable policy framework look like? What are the measures? And that's really important we start that now, because we know we're going to have to tackle that issue. Thank you.
I would go with incentive-based solutions. So if we are to have a target, we need to equip those that want to be getting on board on this. I want my country to be getting on board with this, but we need the means to do it. So I would add on top of the things that has been said now with that.
I would highly agree with what Oliver just said, and to build on that a little bit, I think there needs to be more political understanding that there's a difference between how much negative emissions we need and how much negative emissions the Earth sort of can sustainably supply. Yeah, does that work? Does that work? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a difference between how much we need and how much we will be able to supply, and effectively that changes that affects the net zero equation. So we can meet net zero either with high emissions and high removals, or we can meet it with low emissions and low removals. The point is we need to be minimizing our expectations of how much negative emissions we'll need to rely on. So we need to minimize our residual emissions, and at the same time we need to be looking at maximizing how much negative emissions we can supply within, within the bounds of what is sustainable.
So we've had a really good discussion now on the need, and we covered a lot of different topics between all the participants. We've looked at the need for targets, in particular at the member state level, or national level rather. We've looked at the certification mechanism, the proposal that's due at the end of this month. We've also had a look at the need for emphasis on how we're going to look towards removals in terms of shifting away from a nature versus technical approach towards one that incorporates focus on storage. We've looked at offsets, in particular the markets, what needs to be changed at the voluntary market. So thank you very much, everyone, for a really wonderful discussion, and wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you.